All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Summer of Protocols guest talk series. This series is part of an 18-week program where a cohort of 34 researchers are exploring the various aspects of protocols. You can find out more at summerofprotocols.com. Today, we're going to be talking with Dara O'Rourke. Our next session is on Friday with John Bissell on the protocols of materials synthesis and chemistry. There is a pre-meeting reading material linked there in the program calendar at summerofprotocols.com. So with that, I will pass it off to Venkat to introduce our speaker today.
All right. So I'm excited about this talk because it's one of the themes within the program, even though none of the projects are directly addressing it. It's along with, I think, AI. Climate is one of those big macro themes in the backdrop of everything else going on in the world right now. And one way or the other, I think all of us will somehow be dealing with climate and AI as kind of the backdrop of our life. And we already had Corey's talk on regenerative finance and the crypto angle on climate. And Dara is going to be talking about a much more mainstream traditional approach to climate. But just some background, he's a professor of sustainability sciences at Berkeley, and he started his career studying things like sweatshops, industrial labor, things like that. And at some point, he went entrepreneurial, sort of nonprofit entrepreneurial, and started this site called Good Guide, which kind of allows you to do sustainable shopping, I guess, kind of comparison shopping. But then at some point, he got roped into leading Amazon's sustainability initiative sometime around 2015 or 16, I think. And that's when we met. We were introduced by a mutual friend, and he hired me to work with him building out Amazon's sustainability program. So we kind of worked together on that for like 5-6 years, and it went from basically nothing to building out Amazon sustainability infrastructure internally, all the stuff that and pre-work and auditing and protocols that led up to Amazon's climate pledge that was in the news and net zero announcement. So we were kind of like part of that whole journey, and I got like a ringside seat to that. And all along the time, he was juggling a faculty position at Berkeley, and I think his faculty colleagues were getting a little mad at him for going off to the corporate world and having fun. So eventually, he had to go back and, I don't know, submit himself again to the academic protocols that Angela was complaining about recently. And so he's back. He's writing a book based partly on his Amazon experiences, but also broader experiences. And also since then, we've continued to sort of work on and off together. We recently were on a panel together at the Kern County, California Economic Summit. We're discussing basically energy transitions. So it's kind of like, I don't know, a growing, snowballing kind of like intellectual space that it's like climate is eating the world, and Dara is kind of at the heart of like climate eating the world. So it's going to keep growing in importance. So I think all of us have to get good at thinking about climate. And with that, I'll hand you off to Dara for, I guess, like a, I don't know, deep dive into the deep end.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Venkat. Let me share my screen. Can you all see my screen now?
Yep.
Okay, great. Let me just rearrange my desktop here so I can see all you. Great. And got protocols. So Discord conversation will be in the Discord, not through the Zoom chat, I'm assuming. So I will look for that also. Excellent. So yeah, thank you both to Venkat and Josh for facilitating this conversation. I'm really excited to talk about this. The title is a little bit tongue-in-cheek nod to Andreas Malm's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. Venkat has always encouraged me to think in memes, try to move out of academic speak to talk in memes, but really my talk was originally titled Protocols to Move Companies from Carbon Reporting to Decarbonization Innovation. I want to say at the outset, I'm actually not in favor of blowing up anything. So except maybe fossil fuel delay tactics and greenwash and performative ESG and the billions of dollars that are being spent right now on goals and reports that don't actually help solve climate change. So I actually am in favor of trying to figure out how do we disrupt existing carbon protocols, which I'll go through, which really are focused on external reporting of proxy measures of firms. And how do we move that to actionable internal metrics that embed carbon intelligence and really drive decarbonization? Okay, so I'm going to do this climate change is the fullest of full stacks from literally 45,000 feet in the air, where we have the main greenhouse gas effect, all the way down to soils and microbes and deep ocean mixing. So I'm going to start out with a central dilemma and question that we're going to go through over the next 45 minutes. Do a tiny bit of carbon math from the IPCC all the way up to what companies need to do. Talk about the many protocols that we have in this space. I didn't realize it until Venkat asked me to kind of summarize the protocols, how much I have lived in protocols of a sort since 1989 when I first started working on the Montreal Protocol. But these protocols for climate are highly problematic, unfortunately, and resistant to change, and current proposals, including from the Securities and Exchange Commission, are likely to make things worse, not better. The direction is not good on these protocols right now. Then I'm going to take this turn to lay out this counterintuitive, unlikely example. As Venkat mentioned, I spent 6 years inside Amazon. I'm going to talk about Amazon's carbon system of record. And I totally understand why you would all be skeptical of Amazon as a case, but I'm going to talk about what we can learn from it, how hard it is to change companies like that, and then where we see some real potential for protocols that create mechanisms for supporting radical, rapid decarbonization. That's what I want to get to as a conversation with you all, because you know much more than me about designing protocols, to how to think about protocols for carbon awareness and carbon intelligence that actually will drive this transition. So that's what I want to get to. Okay, so the central dilemma that we start with. We actually know all the causes of climate change. I'll talk about it. The science is clear. We actually know most of the solutions. We actually have the list of solutions. I'll go through that. We know where we need to get to, when we need to get to, how fast we need to get there. Great, all good news. Bad news is the transitions we know we need are being blocked, delayed, and captured currently. So our current climate protocols are actually not supporting and sometimes actually enabling the delay of the radical decarbonization that we need. So we've got some positive news. We see where we need to go. We see the potential of it. We see what we need to do with the Inflation Reduction Act. We've actually got some momentum now. We got a direction, some momentum. And we have a whole bunch of corporations that have signed on to net zero carbon pledges and have signed up for all these goals. So we have direction, but we are basically being blocked and delayed. So the central question, which is a real question that I have for you all, and I want to have an actual conversation about it, is how can protocols be designed to drive corporate action? So I'm going to be talking about corporate decarbonization, corporate actions to rapidly decrease energy, materials, and carbon in products, processes, and supply chains. So I actually am going to take a breath here, and I want to ask this question. So what protocol, when you think of this question, climate change and protocols, what protocol or type of protocol would you think could support the type of innovation that we need to radically decarbonize, reduce energy, materials, and carbon in global industry? That's a real live question for you all. I don't know if people want to come on screen or they want to put into the Discord.
If you would like to speak verbally, feel free to raise your hand or just jump on.
Okay, Kyoto style agreement, legally binding regulatory instruments. Okay, we'll talk about Kyoto. So I know very little about your world of protocols, but I think about what types of
style agreements.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Saffron, you came in late. Say that again. I think I heard part of something from Saffron.
Oh, no, sorry. I was just playing both the live stream and this Zoom, so there was noise.
Okay. So I was saying when I think about protocols that can support the type of innovation we need, I think of, okay, so innovation requires data on, say, customer insights feeding into your R&D team. So how could we feed information in the right form into companies' R&D, or open API specifications that would feed the right type of data between systems that would give them some kind of carbon awareness, or a blockchain or a smart contract that would allow this information to transfer between actors in a global supply chain. So I want you to be thinking as I go through this about possible ways that protocols that you all know much better than me could be driving this. Social protocols, interesting. Okay, so we'll talk about, not sure exactly what you mean by that. We'll talk about social protocols and the potential for maybe incorporating individuals, consumers, us in the acts of decreasing. Okay, social protocols versus data protocols. Interesting. Okay, great. I'm mainly thinking about data protocols, so we'll come through this. All right, so this is where we're going to try to get to, is this question of applying your knowledge and skills to these hard problems of carbon awareness in corporations. Okay, consumer products. All right, so some basic information. We might think about standardized information that would tell consumers about products. Supply chain provenance. Yeah, that's a good hard one. We'll talk about that. Excellent. Okay, so this is our central question we'll come back to. So keep that going in the chat as you're thinking. All right, so state of knowledge. Venkat said I get 30 seconds on all of climate change science. So basically, we know a lot about climate change. These IPCC reports are really critical. They've changed the whole conversation. Basically, a bunch of nerds and a bunch of kids have changed the global conversation about climate change through this thing called the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Luckily, there is a climatechat.ai that you can go, and instead of reading these boring reports, you can just go ask it questions. It'll tell you what's in these reports. So AI has been applied to climate change. But basically, bottom line is it's unequivocal. Human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. It's real, it's bad, and it's us, okay? So no more question, no more scientific debate on this. There's obviously lots of debates in the models, but this is the bottom line. 2018, these kind of toned down comments from scientists are basically like scientists screaming fire at the top of their lungs. Second key point, pace and scale of climate action is insufficient to respond to the climate crisis, the disruptions that are coming. So this really the bottom line. Key number 418.9. That is the current atmospheric concentration of CO2. We're at 418.9 about 2 weeks ago. We're adding about 2 parts per million of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere each year. This is highly correlated. We add about 40 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, which changes about 59 billion tons total greenhouse gases, which is driving up this 2 parts per million per year. Okay, we've known the science of this for a long time, the basic science, and I can come back to this math if anyone wants to, but we know how this works. Human-induced warming, we actually know how this works, is basically a function of cumulative carbon dioxide. So this is all the carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere. It stays up there and has impact for about 100 years. But the bottom line is we observe about a 0.4 degrees C increase in temperature per trillion tons of CO2. So 1,000 gigatons of CO2 leads to a 0.4 degrees C. We've seen about 1.2 degrees C warming to date. And as all of you have probably seen, the goal of the IPCC is to keep us under 1.5 degrees warming. This is where we get to this thing you've heard over and over again in the news. We've got 8 years left till we're doomed. So this is the basic math. So the IPCC has modeled that past emissions, these cumulative emissions, will continue to drive warming for many years. So we have 500 gigatons of CO2 equivalents remaining that can be added to the atmosphere to stay below 1.5 degrees warming. We're at 1.2, we got 0.3 left to go to stay 1.5. This is the threshold at which we see significant increase in climate feedbacks and climate disruptions. We've got about 1,200 gigatons to stay below 2 degrees warming. This is where we get the basic math. Divide 500 by 59 gigatons of global greenhouse gases per year. We get to 8.5 years before we hit this 1.5 degree threshold, about 20 years till we hit this 2 degree threshold. So this is where we get all these goals to hit net zero CO2 emissions by, it was 2050, now most people are saying 2040. So to stay below 1.5 degrees, we've got about 500 gigatons of CO2 left. We're putting in 59 per year currently at current rates. So that's the basic math. And you can look up climateclock.net and see this countdown, look at the math in more detail. Okay. There's a tiny bit of politics behind the math. Here's the first piece of politics. This 1.5 degrees, this 500 gigatons, we got 500 gigatons. Global, the fossil fuel industry holds 2,800 gigatons of carbon in known reserves on their books, listed in their assets, 2,800 gigatons of carbon. So we basically, as a global society, need to decide to not extract 80% of the fossil fuels that we know and are already valued in the assets of Exxon and Chevron and major national oil companies, Saudi Aramco, the Chinese, the Russians. This means we need to write down $10 to $20 trillion in stranded assets, which means asking some of the most powerful companies, people, countries in the world to write down $20 trillion in wealth. So this is, as Chris Hayes has pointed out, the last time that happened was the start of the U.S. Civil War, 1865, which led to 600,000 lives lost. So this asking rich, powerful people to write down this level of assets is challenging. Now, the fossil fuel industry has moved from straight denial of climate change to new strategies of obstruction, which will mainly focus on delay. And unfortunately, our climate protocols often facilitate that delay. Okay, big drivers, energy obviously is the biggest driver. The simple bad pie chart on this, but energy is key. Definitely there's going to be a battle, power, wealth, influence over the energy systems, oil, gas, coal, etc. This will require political organizing, obviously, and taking on these incumbent actors. So activism, community activism, critical long-term, but also, as we'll talk about, some technical strategy. A little bit easier way to see this, hopefully, if you can see it on your screen, Sankey diagram of sources. So energy is still the biggest source. Oops, sorry. Electricity and heat, buildings, transportation, about 14% globally, but in California, it's more like 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions are from transportation, agriculture. So we basically can see the breakdown leading to the four main drivers of climate change: CO2, methane, nitrous oxides, and chlorofluorocarbons. Okay, so we know the drivers, we know how this works. And the Paris Agreement has basically set a bunch of national goals of decarbonization. With the current country commitments, we are able to bend these curves to a 2.7 degrees C warming. So the current commitments of governments only get us down to 2.7. Now that's a lot better than 4 or 5 degrees C, which is what the global scientific community feared in 2018. We were on track to something like 4 or 5 degrees C. But we still need about a 30% cut to get below 2, 55% cut to get to 1.5, which is about a 5% per year reduction in carbon emissions. So we got to figure out how to get to net zero as fast as possible. This curve is basically that, I think it was the purple wedge that Corey showed a couple of weeks ago. This is the industrial decarbonization wedge. This is, and then he was talking more down in this carbon removals, carbon offsets. What do you do to go negative, to pull carbon out of the air? But this is the wedge that we're talking about. How do we bend this curve? Now, there's actually some positive news. This is from Zeke Hausfather from Climate Brink. So we actually have seen emissions are no longer following the worst case scenario. So this RCP 8.5, which was our worst case scenario, we've actually have flattened the curve on global energy. So we're really seeing a shift from this 4 degrees to 2.7. This is due primarily to accelerating energy transitions, as Venkat mentioned. Rapidly falling costs of solar, wind, and batteries, which has really killed off the coal industry certainly in the US and Europe, but also in many other parts of the world. and about $1 trillion in investments in clean energy in 2022, up from about 800 billion in 21, up from 600 billion in 2020. So a really positive trend upwards on investments in this energy transition, industrial solar, industrial wind, advanced geothermal, some small scale nukes, et cetera. This is really positive. We're seeing a decreasing CO2 per unit of energy of about 2% per year, a carbon intensity improving about 0.3% per year. So we're getting more efficient, decoupling our GDP and our energy from. So this is very positive. Emissions are no longer on the worst case scenario. Okay, another quick question for you. Drop in the chat. So what do we need to change in our systems to get to net zero carbon? So what systems, industrial systems, do you think are most important that we change to drive this transition to net zero carbon globally? Okay, energy production, definitely. Oil and gas to renewables, great. No, that's right. That is key. That's like first and foremost. We got to transition. Energy is the big one. Okay, Dorian, I like your point. Great, steel, materials. We got a bunch of energy and industrial systems. Price the environment, I like it. Materially embodied carbon. Okay, interesting. Concrete is a big one. Great. Okay, so basically, energy. Number one, we got to do energy, transportation, materials, buildings, industry, industrial, we'll talk a lot more about. Agricultural land use is a really hard one, and consumer products. We'll have to get to also. Great. Good list, good list. Okay, so basically we need to change pretty much everything, everywhere, all at once is the bottom line here. 100% renewably powered, all electric, basically electrify everything. We got to get fossil fuels out of all electricity generation by 2040. Radical increase in energy efficiency. We've got to reduce our need for energy. This kind of RED strategy, reduce, electrify, decarbonize. We got to add in carbon pricing up and down global supply chains, meaningful impact. The problem on this one is that the price you need a carbon price to be at that actually will drive the radical decarbonization is politically untenable. So this would actually work if we had the political wherewithal to actually raise carbon taxes, but we don't in any jurisdiction. Rapid transition away from internal combustion engine vehicles, move to zero carbon mass transit, zero waste manufacturing, net zero buildings with sustainable materials, the steel, the concrete, the wood, plastics, circular economy, we'll talk about that, sustainable food systems. And then we need, as Corey pointed out, about 10,000 large-scale carbon removal facilities operating. We need to be pulling gigatons of carbon out of the air by 2050. And we need a just transition policy. So again, this all seems daunting. This seems really, really hard, but this also is potentially the next industrial revolution. This is the largest boom in industrial investment and rebuilding of our global economy in the last 100 years. So there's a huge challenge here and a huge opportunity here. Okay, so how are we going to drive it? We have the protocols. Montreal Protocol actually was our starting point, as I mentioned. So Montreal Protocol is actually a protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. It's actually arguably the most effective international environmental agreement in history. There's no other international environmental agreement that's as effective as the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol started out focused on ozone depleting substances. It turned out that a number of the replacements were global warming potential substances. So it now has something called the Kigali Amendment, which is focusing on high global warming potential chemicals. Montreal Protocol, I can talk about later, incredibly effective, super effective. The Kyoto Protocol, 10 years later, which basically operationalizes the UN systems on climate change by creating this kind of international system for reducing greenhouse gases. The convention asks countries to adopt policies and measures to mitigate. The Kyoto Protocol has been largely a failure, really unsuccessful. So Montreal, very successful. Kyoto, very ineffective. Very little reduction in greenhouse gases from the Kyoto Protocol, whereas the Montreal Protocol effectively phased out ozone depleting substances, saved the ozone layer, and radically transformed the chemical industry around the world. Some other key ones. The Carbon Disclosure Project. This is our reporting layer for carbon. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol. This is the accounting layer for carbon. ISO 14064. This is the ISO standard for doing life cycle assessment of carbon accounting. I think Corey mentioned the Verified Carbon Standard for offsets. Climate Registry. This was set up originally in California, now voluntary protocol. Science-Based Targets Initiative. This is the goal setting layer for carbon. Task Force on Climate Disclosures. This is a new layer on climate risk, which has been growing. And we are about to see the SEC was supposed to announce a new regulation on climate and carbon disclosure last month. It was delayed for the second time. Now it's supposed to come out in the fall. The EU is moving towards regulated carbon disclosure and climate risk disclosure. And so these things are moving from voluntary systems to they look to be regulated shortly. So I want to talk about the three most important for corporate action, and they are the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, CDP, and SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative. So Greenhouse Gas Protocol is basically the accounting layer, sets out how corporations should account for their carbon emissions. This is the playbook that almost every corporation uses. Something like 90% of the Fortune 500 uses the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for accounting for their carbon, how they measure their carbon. Really important, weird vagary of this protocol is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, back when it was set up in 2001, created 3 scopes of emissions. This is weirdly important to care about. Scope 1 is your direct emissions. This is like the diesel you put in the truck you own to deliver the Amazon package, or the diesel you put in the generator to run your building. Scope 1, your direct emissions. Scope 2, this is all of the emissions related to the electricity that you use anywhere in your operations. So Scope 2 is basically all the energy producing electricity. So this is a huge area for the move from fossil fuels to renewables is in Scope 2. And Scope 3 is everything else. And Scope 3 for most companies is 80% of their footprint. And it is actually somebody else's Scope 1 and Scope 2. So it's super weird that they chose to basically have a really small Scope 1, a pretty small and really focused Scope 2, your electricity, and then everything else upstream of you, all the raw materials extracted in some country somewhere to go into your batteries, to go into some truck, to go into some boat, to go into some supply chain, to go into a thing that comes to you. And then all of your downstream impacts, you ship it to a consumer, a retailer, whatever, they use it, they dispose of it. All of that, both the upstream and the downstream, is all Scope 3. So Scope 3, really massive and problematic in many ways we'll talk about. The thread is going fast. Maybe Venkat, you can flag me if you think I should stop and answer any questions in the Discord, or if there's anything I should. I'm not able to track it while I'm going. Okay, so GHG protocol is the accounting layer. CDP, formerly known as a Carbon Disclosure Project, is the reporting layer. This is what basically all of those Fortune 500 countries report their carbon emissions to the CDP. It's a UK nonprofit. They run this disclosure platform. It was originally just carbon. Now it also includes water and forests. This is basically the biggest platform for self-reported data. It's mainly used by investors to evaluate publicly traded firms on their reporting, and has had rapid growth over the last few years. 200 firms back in 2002. Now they're at 18,000 firms 20 years later. So they're growing. The red is the carbon. I think the blue is water and forest down below. So really rapid growth. CDP has all sorts of problems also. The biggest problem is basically you report to CDP these kind of annualized roll-ups of your total emissions of Scope 1, 2, 3. And it turns out that kind of aggregated roll-up data that you submit to this platform is actually not very useful to anybody. It's not useful to a corporation internally, as I talked about, but also not that useful even to investors. This has been a key piece of data, CDP data, feeds into many of the ESG rating systems, which has led to much confusion and little ability to actually evaluate and compare firms. Okay, so you got accounting layer, reporting layer, and then this is the targets layer. The goals layer is the Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI. This is the platform for setting your decarbonization goals and your trajectory to get to zero. How are you going to bend these curves, your carbon emissions? So this also voluntary platform, all three of these voluntary platforms, interestingly, all three basically set up by the same small group of about 5 NGOs are involved in all three. And this one basically asks companies to set a goal, a target, and then report on it. And so I grabbed one from Delta Airlines, but basically every single target's a little bit different. And so you've got about 4,000 companies now reporting these net zero targets. They're supposed to be aligned with the Paris Agreement, aligned with 1.5 or aligned with 2. They're really also really problematic. So here's Delta. I don't know if you can read this, but Delta Airlines commits to reduce well-to-wake scope 1 and 3 jet fuel greenhouse gas emissions 45% per revenue ton kilometer by 2035 from a 2019 base year. This is basically impossible for me even to parse what that means, let alone for me to compare it to United or KLM or anyone else. So this is, everyone basically is reporting differently. Yeah, right. So this, even Delta, how does Delta have a net zero goal? Well, it turns out they just got sued in California yesterday for $1 billion for, oh, actually it was in the UK, excuse me, for $1 billion for this kind of false advertising that they're basically going to offset all of their emissions. They're buying a little bit of sustainable aviation fuel, but basically they're going to offset all their emissions. And as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, there's critiques of these offsets that they've purchased that they aren't real. So they're being accused of basically false statements. Okay, but basically every major company is now under pressure to measure and model their emissions, to create an action plan to get to zero, and then to invest in actions to decarbonize their businesses, and then to report it all out, to show they're doing it, and to show this year they're doing what gets them to zero in 2040 or 2050. With the SEC in the EU and the UK, probably they'll be required also to report their climate risk. This is part of the new regulations are, what is the risk to your business of climate change, physical risk to your assets, and then what is the risk, what they call transition risks in the transition. Okay, so every company is now required to do this reporting, or not required, but they're under pressure. They see it coming from the SEC and the EU and other regulators. Turns out this is hard. There are no easy glide paths and few win-win MAC curves, what McKinsey called the marginal abatement curves, the easy win-win profitable ways to do this. Brad Smith, president of Microsoft, says, look, there's 3,500 companies signed up for pledges, but there does not yet exist capacity for almost any company to, with confidence, turn their pledges into progress that they've promised. So this really is kind of the rub here. So he says almost no company can actually do the decarbonization. So the CDP themselves looked at their own reporting of these 18,000 firms. The firm turns out 0.4% actually have a credible decarbonization plan. So the CDP themselves has said we basically have all the people reporting really nice goals rolled up, and only about 0.4% can actually decarbonize. And the ones that actually can decarbonize are only really going to get us about a 2% reduction in carbon. So this is really not great news. Between 2020 and 2030, we're seeing emissions reductions from these pledges of only about 2%. So the problem we've got is going to be highly centralized, weak, voluntary protocols run by this small group of NGOs, WRI, WF, CDP, WBS, CSD, that has turned internal accounting into this external reporting and goals. And it's very easily gameable. So the very first carbon footprint for consumers, as many of you may know, was actually developed by British Petroleum. BP started circulating carbon footprints to try to get consumers to look at their own footprint, to kind of get people to think about their footprint, not BP's footprint. So we've got lots of kind of gaming. Chevron has released their aspirations for carbon to get to net zero by 2050. This is even, I think, more questionable than the Delta thing we just looked at, that they are hoping to eliminate scope 1 and scope 2 and help to enable scope 3. That's everyone using their oil and gas products to reduce. This obviously has come under lots of attack. So we have lots of cases where we have lots of companies that are basically pledging that someday, somehow, they will reduce their carbon, and they'll somehow net it out at net zero in some day. And so we basically are in this situation where this is a nonprofit in Europe. No, so Chevron's scope 1 is really tiny. It's just the running of their own operations, running their own trucks, carrying oil or things like that. So other people burning Chevron's oil would be the other company or our individual scope 1. But right now we're basically in the situation, it's virtually impossible to compare corporate emissions. We really can't look at companies and know how they're doing on these issues. We've got these problems of data modeling, aggregation problems, actionability problems, integration problems, incentive problems. And again, I'm going fast, so I can come back to these if we want to dig in on the problems. But we've got a whole set of problems that have led to this really limited effect of the current protocols on driving the decarbonization we need. Now, for every hard, difficult, complex solution, there's usually a simple answer, and it's usually wrong, as Mark Twain said. So we've got lots of simple solutions being proposed. Consultants have discovered carbon. Big accounting firms all see huge dollar signs with the SEC and EU. While Venkat and I were at Amazon, we were regularly asked, can they borrow our 10,000-year clock to tell us what time it is? That was a joke just for Venkat. I don't know if it worked. But the old borrow your watch to tell you what time it is thing was just the consultants know nothing, and they're basically charging huge sums to these firms to offer them marginal abatement curves and sustainability action plans and sustainability websites and blah, blah, blah. The VCs have discovered carbon accounting. There are at least 4 startups, I won't name them, that have been funded in the 50 million plus to do automagic carbon footprinting. None of it works. I've looked at all of them, but they're basically being sold on basically what's called economic output LCA with some simple financial software to turn that into carbon footprinting. Very problematic, but literally hundreds of millions of dollars of going into this. There's actually more startups tokenizing carbon offsets than working on decarbonization, as far as I can tell, which is interesting. I would like to see more startups actually going into how do we manage the actual carbon awareness of firms rather than the offsets game, which is all sorts of problematic, like the flow carbon types doing questionable things in that space. And then the NGO community, I think, is really demanding action on absolute reductions right now, which almost no firms can deliver, right? This is to turn around this industrial system, even to switch from like ICE vehicles to EVs is a 5 to 10 year process, which takes massive investment in new vehicles, new charging infrastructure. So even the people that are all in on, say, switching to EVs can't show decarbonization yet. So the demand for absolute reductions doesn't work. The demand for commit to this reduction by this year, it's kind of not how innovation works. Demand for just more reporting, the demand for more plans, more coalitions. We've got kind of all these NGO demands, which I think unfortunately are just going to like continue to demand kind of more output metrics, proxy metrics, roll-ups, and joining things and pledging things, as opposed to the down and in hard work that we need to do. So this is where I think we really need to shift the focus from this kind of up and out reporting to down and in focus on changes in core business processes that drive rapid decarbonization. For me, this is input metrics for internal innovation processes rather than output metrics for reporting. Okay, so this is where I want to talk about Amazon's carbon footprint and carbon system of record. And again, I totally get why you would all be skeptical, and I want you to be skeptical and push back on the question of Amazon and what they've done and what they haven't done. They historically have been famously non-transparent. They didn't disclose to TDP. They didn't disclose to SBTI. They didn't participate in all the clubs and coalitions. They just, I think today there's an employee walkout, which is partly about return to office, but partly about carbon. So there's lots of reasons to critique Amazon, but they basically were interestingly invested in building an Amazon-like data system. Amazon is obviously a platform with a lot of protocols. They really do get data, and they really do think about how do they use data to drive internal innovation systems. So we basically, as Venkat mentioned, worked with a team inside Amazon to build a system of record for carbon, to track their emissions all the way down to individual shipments, servers, devices. And Amazon is really like 30 different companies in one. It's like the global economy. It is in 100 countries. It's got thousands of facilities, thousands of different vehicles and vehicle types around the world. So it's a really interesting hard physical and software company to deal with. Okay, so what we did basically was built these 5 models using this academic method called environmental life cycle assessment. We built 4 process models on transportation, electricity use, packaging, and devices. And then we built this economic input output model, this financial model on the left, which basically uses, it's a dollar-based method for turning basically financial data, how much you spend on servers or blue jeans or fuel or whatever, and you turn that into emissions factors. So this is the simplest way, which I can go into, where you basically, if you know $1 million of spend within a company, you can calculate their carbon emissions based on these emissions factors per dollar of different business types. Okay, so what we built was through these 5 models, we're able to basically, first of all, track all of Amazon's carbon emitting activities. They have lots of fuel, obviously. They've got planes, boats, trucks, vans, e-cargo bikes. They've got buildings. They've got the largest, obviously, cloud computing company in the world. They're one of the largest logistics company in the world. They have a large electronics supply chain company. We converted that to these emissions layers. We then connected this through this orchestration layer that then allowed us to basically determine the overall carbon footprint of the entire corporation of Amazon. Once you have that overall view of the entire company, then you can go in detail into each of these. So I'll just talk about, basically, we use these EIO LCA to get the overall view, the global view, which allows you to see the hotspots. And then you use these process models of lifecycle assessment to go deeper. So talk about transportation. So when you dig in on transportation, we know that it's just EIO, economic input output LCA. And for transportation, you want to build a specific model that drills in on the fuel types, the vehicle types, the exact routes that the company is driving. And that then allows you to analyze a network and to design for better vehicles or alternative fuels, or how do you drop in EVs, or how do you drop in drones? And so we built these super detailed models then for each hotspot. EIO gives you the overall view, hotspot for transportation, hotspot for devices, hotspot for data centers, hotspot for packaging, whatever. You can then go in deep on this. This then allowed us to build this system of record, basically. So we built this Spark application in native AWS running on EMR clusters, basically this system that allows for granular data, but at an Amazon scale, so that you're able to do the roll up of the carbon footprint, but you're really giving individual teams actionable information that allows them the optionality to choose how they can reduce their carbon. So the goal is both better tracking and better decisions that then drive this kind of action we want. We want to make the business decisions carbon aware. So it's not just about keeping score, reporting out, or doing sustainability reports. It's about internal detailed views with actionable metrics that allow teams to take action to reduce carbon. This is where I think most firms are not doing this. Most firms are still in Excel spreadsheets and annual glossy reports. And we basically need to move towards supporting internal decarbonization innovation. Okay, so right, the simple version of innovation in my mind, and you all probably know this better than me, but is like innovation is this iterative mix of new push technologies, new technologies coming forward, and customer demand pulling backward. Like, how do we mix customer insights on pain points with new technologies that can solve those pain points? So it's this kind of back and forth between new tech and customer demand. So this is what we got to figure out. How do we connect new technologies, new insights to these demands, these problems? So how do we do this for really simply reduce the need for a high carbon thing? How do we dematerialize, move from physical to digital, improve truck utilization, server utilization, Or how do we move from a high carbon thing to a lower carbon thing? Just how do we swap a high carbon material for a high carbon product, a high carbon server, high carbon factory, high carbon country? How do we basically help decision makers inside companies move and just basically do this substitution from high carbon to low carbon, material, component, product, power source, factory, data center, whatever it is? This is kind of the base challenge. We need to integrate carbon awareness into the set of decisions that innovative companies make. Number one thing every smart company should be doing is constant optimization, right? So how do you get carbon into your optimization algorithms? I'll talk about that in a second. That's the first one. Second, how do you get them to adopt low carbon technologies? This is a key part of the game for the next 10 years, is get companies to adopt expensive low carbon technologies, scale them, and drive down their cost so they become mainstream. That's what we've done on solar, on wind, and batteries. Wright's law has driven down the cost of solar, wind, and batteries 90% by scaling and driving down the cost. We got to do that for everything: steel and sustainable aviation fuel and concrete and 1,000 other things. 3, how do we get carbon into R&D and investment decision for the actual long-term innovations? There are places, probably 20% of our problems we don't have real solutions for. We actually have to invent zero carbon aviation. It doesn't exist yet. So how are we going to do it? We're going to have to invest in significant innovation in green hydrogen and fuel cells and new types of planes. So you got to get it in there. And then finally, we got to get it in supply chain management. How do you build carbon awareness and this intelligence within supply chains? So this is, interestingly, in the kind of Clayton Christensen world of innovation, this is what he would dismiss as incremental and sustaining innovation. For most corporations, this is not disruptive innovation. This is incremental. It's just swap in a low carbon thing for your existing high carbon thing. We need kind of semi-automated modular substitutions that allow us to understand, here's the carbon of a thing, here's another thing that can do that same job that's a lower carbon, and then here's the cost basically curve that will allow you to bring it down to cost parity or below. Because the problem right now is these low carbon things are more expensive than the high carbon things. So we got to figure out these kind of top sources of carbon and then provide information to decision makers within companies on carbon per thing, cost per thing, and then how you basically can build it into your innovation cycles to adopt, iterate, learn, scale, drive down the cost to mainstream these low carbon things. So this is at the simplest level. This is like, forget the really hard, long-term, deep tech innovation. It's basically, how do we help companies swap low carbon for high carbon? And it's basically just a factor substitution in many cases. And how do we then build that into design software, procurement software, sourcing software, finance software, so they basically are able to see the carbon and the cost of a thing, and then connect this information on carbon or decarbonization with internal customers making specific decisions. This is my version of innovation: tech forward, customer demand, internal customer demand backward. So you connect these carbon solutions with decision makers inside firms that can actually adopt them. What you want is the team closest to the problem, the source of carbon, to determine how to innovate to decarbonize. So you got to get this information deep down into these business units so that they get actionable metrics to feed into existing mechanisms. So I know really deeply how Amazon drives innovation. I don't know how Apple does it. I don't know how Microsoft does it. I don't know how whatever Siemens does it. But you got to get into existing innovation mechanisms, the carbon awareness at the right level. Okay, in a couple of places we were able to do that in Amazon. So in the transportation little model I showed you there, we developed this very actionable metric: grams of CO2 equivalents per unit shipped. So Amazon can now track every single unit they ship, which is billions per year, and they know the grams of carbon per leg from a Chinese factory to Dorian's front door. And they know if it went on a plane, a train, a boat. They know FedEx, UPS, Amazon. They can basically track down to grams of CO2 per unit per kilometer globally. And they can now make decarbonization decisions, efficiency improvements, optimization. Now, ideally, you move this from someone seeing it on a spreadsheet every Monday morning, which is one mechanism, to ideally you incorporate it into the optimization algorithms. You want grams of CO2 in the demand prediction algorithm, in the procurement algorithm, in the inventory placement algorithm, in the route optimization algorithm, so that Amazon is algorithmically decarbonizing the global supply chain from factory to your front door at every stage 24 hours a day, not by good intentions, not some nice sustainability team, but the optimization algorithms are optimizing for speed and customer satisfaction and cost and carbon. So ideally, if you have the right metric, you will optimize to get the right products in the right amounts in the right places at the right time to deliver low carbon products to your house. The device division at Amazon developed a different metric, kilograms of CO2 per device use year. I think this is a really good metric also that allows them to think about a Kindle and go, if we extend its life by 1 year, we can radically reduce its carbon per use. And so you think, what's the actionable metric for a customer and a design team for them to then optimize the full life cycle of a product? Okay, so right now I'm coming to the conclusion here. Sorry, I want to get to a conversation, is that most of the carbon protocols and the focus on changing them and the SEC draft guidance make me really nervous. They're basically just going to extend this kind of goals and aggregate metrics and not really focus on the internal work that is key to driving the decarbonization investment. So if I were going to blow up a carbon pipeline, I would focus on the greenwash ones and I focus on the delay ones, right? So we actually do need a part of our work, and your work has to be this kind of activist orientation of taking on fossil fuel interests. This is not an open blank scientific debate. This is one in which I said $20 trillion of wealth are on the line here. So there are vested interests that are going to try to block, delay, obfuscate. So we actually do need to think about protocols and strategies and activist strategies and consumer strategies that help to destabilize incumbent systems. And then we need to really focus on building these protocols that share key data on low carbon technologies that ultimately kind of enable this open distributed carbon intelligence, and then the mechanisms that will feed and support radical, rapid carbon and decarbonization innovation. Whew. Okay, I'll take a break. Stop there, and hopefully you have a chance to converse, and I can try to catch up on the thread. So Venkat, do you manage the conversation, or what do you want to do?
Josh, that's Josh.
Josh, okay, great.
Yeah, so thanks so much for that, Dara. It was super insightful. Anybody who has some questions, go ahead and raise your hand. I think, Tim, you had a question in the Discord thread there.
Yes, thank you so much. This is really insightful. I guess I'd be curious to hear your thoughts just about like energy generation, like things like nuclear and fusion. So you mentioned, we're not doing enough around like carbon removal. But yeah, do you think, because that seems to be another area where like more and more dollars are being poured in. Do you think that's valuable, or another sort of dead end or proxy?
Oh yeah, no. Yeah. For sure. So the thing that we've seen the fastest, so I'm in favor of rapid transitions, and ideally rapid transitions that also have guardrails for equity and the distributional impacts of those transitions. But when we think rapid transitions, the things that we've seen the fastest learning curves and the fastest like basically cost curves coming down and then technologies taking over are things that are modular, non-complex, non-requiring customizable technologies. So solar and wind and batteries are obvious examples. Nuclear, if we could make it small and modular, you could imagine you could actually get the iteration cycles where you could learn and scale it and bring down the cost. Right now, nuclear is the most bespoke of all technologies. So everything is $20 billion over budget and 10 years delayed. So, nuclear, if we could figure out how to modularize it and scale it and radically drive then it's interesting. Right now, it's moving too slow to be useful. It's like, the next generation of nukes are going to come online in 2045 or something. So great. But so I'm more bullish on things that we can think, which are the ones that like, can we figure out how to do green hydrogen at scale? And that's got a couple of different problems to it. Can we figure out how to direct air capture at scale? It's got a couple of problems to it. But you can break down the problems and then you invest in the radical learning that scales and drives down the cost, and then it takes over. But yeah, advanced geothermal, there's a bunch of just energy technologies that are early in labs. We got to figure out, the average, I think you're going to talk materials next week, from lab to commercial is like 20 years on a new material. We don't have 20 years. We need to shrink that to 5 years. So how do you speed up these learning cycles to get them out? And it takes a bunch of places where you take out the bottlenecks and you drive the learning faster.
Awesome, thanks.
Should
Other
I-
questions? Or did you have something else to say?
No, I'm
Great.
happy to
Dorian?
take questions.
Yeah, hang on a second. I always get the mute and the lower hand mix up. So I had a question in the chat that had to do with simulate, like why not just simulate like all of the companies? And then you talked about this the modeling with Amazon. I guess I sort of thought about it in a kind of an adversarial sense, like, okay, like let's say you go and you just make a simulation of all the companies in the world, which is not impossible. And then you just say like, we think you're burning this much fossil fuel. We think you're producing this much CO2. Prove us wrong. Like,
Yep.
Take it sort of like from an adversarial perspective. I don't know, like how dumb that is or what.
No, it's really smart. 350.org, the activist group, did that for Amazon before Amazon disclosed its carbon footprint, and they weren't that far off. I mean, basically, this economic input output, you basically take the dollar value of, say, how many billion dollars, so whatever, Amazon's a $500 billion company, you break it down by the sectors they're in, and you can get a pretty good rough cut, order of magnitude, on carbon emissions from company Amazon or company Apple or company Walmart or company Carrefour or whatever. Okay, so that's definitely useful as kind of, this is the kind of, here's what we think your footprint is. It's still not actionable though. The problem with that data, and this is the problem with all the tech firms, is it's tied to your dollars of thing. So for fast growing companies like Apple and Google and Amazon, their emissions just go up with their sales, with their dollar value. So Apple and Amazon and Microsoft and Google, all their absolute emissions continue to grow. Despite huge investments in renewables, they're becoming more carbon intensive efficiently. They're reducing their carbon intensity, but their absolute emissions continue to grow. So that financial model doesn't give you the internal view to go, what do I need to switch between two chips or two servers or two materials to actually decarbonize this business that's going to continue to grow or not?
So did Amazon make a manual of what you showed and like a toolkit for actually implementing it?
Yeah. And of course, as you might imagine, like when we built our first systems, like everyone up to the board of directors, their first thing they said was decarbonization as a service. Like Amazon knows how to build platforms, build it once, sell it twice. So everyone was like, how do we turn this into a service? We said, whoa, settle down. We got to like make it work first and actually get it to work here. So yeah, so it's not a manual, but it's like basically what you want is basically apply machine learning to matching your business operation with your carbon emissions, with your carbon alternatives, and you can get much smarter, faster on how to like swap things and reduce things. And so, yeah, so they're building internal tooling for this that probably at some point they'll expose and try to sell, I would guess, but they aren't yet.
Great. Corey?
Yeah, just a question about I think I just lost it. You may have to come back to me. Yeah, sorry.
Cool. Any other questions floating around there right now?
Dara, I know this is slightly off topic, but you recently did work with the Kern County and look at a very, very different environment of this kind of innovation. It's a county, but it's still kind of like a corporate region of like energy production, right? So can you speak briefly to that?
Yeah, that's super interesting. So for those of you in California, Kern County is in kind of the central part of California. Many of you may have driven past it. The closest you probably come is Bakersfield, which is the home of Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker of the House. And it is also the center of energy in California, #1 county for producing oil and gas, and #1 county for producing wind and solar. It is going big on carbon capture. It's going big on green hydrogen. It just discovered lithium. So it's kind of the center of the energy transition in California is in this central rural county. And it's a really interesting battle over the transition where there are huge, Chevron's a big investor in Kern County. Kern County was the #1 producer of oil in the United States for many, many years based on these Chevron oil wells in Kern County. And now Chevron has launched a direct air capture, carbon capture company. Occidental Petroleum, big in Kern County, has spun off a firm. It's now called Carbon TerraVault. They're going to be big in direct air capture. So the companies that were pulling carbon out of the ground are now competing to pump it back underground. So it's a really interesting battleground for this transition. And of course, incumbents want to eke out every last dollar of oil and gas while figuring out the transition economics of being able to profit off of carbon capture and storage. So it's super interesting, and lots of battles over permitting and impacts on agriculture. And so it's a really heated battleground for this transition.
So I did have a question related to that. And I'm curious, so what you're painting here is that the energy companies are likely the best positioned to be dealing with this direct air capture kind of tech, right? And
they have some of the exact same skills they know how to build pipes and pump things in one or the other direction. So yeah, they've got some really core assets that could be utilized for carbon capture and storage.
And so how does that, I mean, if you just forecast that out and you think, okay, great, well then doesn't that in a lot of ways incentivize the continuation of fossil fuel extraction if these energy producers are moving more towards like climate management companies? And where do you see in just the landscape of stuff that you're tracking groups or initiatives that are trying to actively like counter that from being the direction that we move in? Because I feel like that is one of the more likely scenarios that we find ourselves in, is that these big oil and gas companies maintain their entrenched sort of status as these monopoly players in just like climate management, and that are still profiting off of their position in relationship to that.
Yeah, it's really, this is one, Venkat, I want you to weigh in. Venkat once said to me, sometimes the bad guys can be good guys, and sometimes the good guys are really bad guys. And you gotta be willing to parse who can play what role in your disruption. And I think to get the scale and speed of transition we need, we're gonna have to get some incumbent actors to refocus their massive amounts of capital and their infrastructure and their skills on the transition. So I'm not against figuring out, could Oxy be the one that you carve off of the oil majors and then partner with Oxy with some startups and some NGOs and some local EJ groups to do a good version of direct air capture and storage. And then you continue to, go against Exxon and Chevron and Saudi Aramco as the bad guys who are just totally cynical. But I think we're probably going to have to figure out, can you carve off any of those companies? So again, Amazon, very problematic company. I know many of you don't like Amazon, but they're really good at sending market signals, scaling, driving down costs. So their order of 100,000 EVs has transformed the whole auto industry. One order, they invested in Rivian, the startup, and then they ordered 100,000 EVs. It changed the whole industry. So they're a kind of a problematic actor that drove a really important market signal that's going to get a flywheel going. But I think there's a bunch of really bad actors that are going to do the very cynical version of what you just intimated, Corey, that we really have to worry about. And so I think there's a key role of the taking on the incumbents in this process that we cannot ignore. This is not all happy green boom. We're all going to make money off of it. Let's all, Dorian's got the meme stock on the way down, and I'm going to go meme stocks on the way up, and we're all going to be rich, right? We'll short it and we'll long it, and we'll all be good. There's going to be disruption here, and there's going to be a fight over wealth. And so there's going to be some really bad actors. The chair of COP28 is from basically the energy company of the United Arab Emirates. We're basically going to have an oil executive running COP28 this coming year. And so there's lots of problematic conversations here with major players in this.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dara. We are running out of time here, so probably call it here. Lots of great conversation in the Discord thread, so keep it going there if you'd like to. We will see you all on Friday for a conversation with John Bissell at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thanks again, Dara.
Great. Yep. Thank you. Thanks, Josh. Thanks.